Hello and welcome to the Self-Recording Band podcast. I am your host, Benedikt, and I'm here with my friend and co-host, Malcolm owen-flood. How are you, Malcolm?
Hello, I'm great, Benny. How are you, sir?
I'm doing great. As I said to you before, we have wonderful summer weather in March, which is not the way it's supposed to be, but it feels great. So yeah, all good.
I'm going to jump right into what I think we need to both talk about because I'm very excited about it, but we also need to remind our listeners about it. So it's pertinent information as well. We are about 2 days and 10 hours away from the end of our early bird pricing on our mixing course, Mixes Unpacked. Hopefully, if you are a listener of this podcast and in part of our Facebook community and any of our email lists, you already should be well aware about this mixing course. But just in case you're not, it is Benny and I each going through our own separate mixes that we've done with bands. And the coolest part is that these bands recorded the tracks DIY themselves and then sent them to us for mixing. So it's not us mixing like perfect, high budget, perfectly engineered studio tracks. This is like they made it in their jam space and we took it to a professional level from there. So I think it's super relatable and valuable for our audience, and that's you listeners. So please check that out. The early bird pricing is a no-brainer. There's a bunch of bonus like modules and other stuff that you get if you do go for the early bird pricing, and that is actually worth more than what we're selling the entire course for. So it's kind of like we just wanted to over-deliver and make it a complete no-brainer, and I think we really did that. Plus, there's a 30-day money-back guarantee, no questions asked. So just try it. There's no reason not to. And again, you have a very little time. Actually, and I said that there's 2 days and 10 hours left, but that was when we're recording it. That's right now. Yeah. For you, it's like 10 hours. You have 10 hours.
If you're listening, the second this podcast comes out, you have 10 hours or so left.
Yeah,
and
maybe less.
If you're listening, yes, exactly. If you're listening after Wednesday, after the day this episode airs, then you can still get it, but the early bird pricing will be gone. And so be quick. Go to the selfrecordingband.com/mixes unpacked, and then you have all the details, all the info, and you can just buy it. And if you, for whatever reason, think it's not as valuable as we say it is, then you get your money back. It's as simple as that.
Absolutely.
Also, I have to add one thing, that one part of the bonuses is something I'm really excited about, and that is that we do a live session, a Q&A session, a video meetup with everybody who's in the course. And we do that because we don't want you to have any sort of questions or anything you're wondering about or anything you don't fully get from the course. So we try to leave no question unanswered, and that's why we do this. So the way it works is you go through this course, you leave comments below, you'd make notes, and you leave comments below the videos telling us what you find most valuable, and also telling us what you didn't quite understand or what you need help with or where you need like further explanation or anything like that. And then you can jump on a call with us, on a group call, and we'll address all of those questions. And if you can't make it live, there will be a replay also. So we're really, like, there's serious like hand-holding with this course. And we make sure that you really get something out of this and you can actually apply it and not just consume content. So again, go to the selfrecordingband.com/mixes unpacked and watch Malcolm and I do what we always talk about.
Yeah,
you can actually watch us do it. So
yeah, and I know there's a lot of musicians in the self-recording band community that are interested in mixing and want to learn more about that. So it's perfect for those people. But even if you don't plan to mix, and that is honestly something we often suggest on this platform, is to focus on engineering because that's much more accessible and possible to get right in a DIY setup without tons and years of experience. But by learning about the mixing side of things, you will become a better engineer. So this is still for the people that don't plan to become mixers. You'll learn so much about what we're looking for to make good tracks and what we do to get it there. And then you can handle that while you're recording it.
100%. All right, one more time, the selfrecordingband.com/mixes unpacked. And then, go get it.
Yeah, the clock is ticking.
Exactly. Super exciting, man, especially because it's the first thing that Malcolm and I do together. So this is something special for us because I've launched a couple of things before, but this time we're doing it together. And it's just fun, and we love you. We hope that you get something out of it. We love to do this. So yes.
This is the first thing we've done together aside from 111 episodes of a podcast.
Yeah, the first product we created together, the first like in-depth thing that totally.
Yeah. No, I'm totally pumped on it.
Yeah, totally. So about today's episode, this is something that we actually also like you'll see that also in this course, by the way. So you'll see us use drum samples, and one thing that I think both of us really like, if like for most genres, not every genre, but for most genres in the rock and guitar music world, sort of, I think Malcolm and I both like drums that sound like drums, even though there might be samples blended with the original drums. So there are ways to do that and make the drum samples invisible, so that all you're hearing is a cool drum kit that just sounds better than what has been recorded originally. And in this episode today, we're going to walk you through how to make sample enhancement or replacement on drums invisible. This is something I get asked quite a lot, and I've worked on with my coaching students a lot also, because I see similar mistakes over and over again. So people are aware of the concept of like triggering samples and blending them with the original kit and stuff. So that's nothing new, but there is different approaches to that, and some of them sound more natural to me than others.
Yep.
And I see people make the same sort of mistakes that lead to a very unnatural, overprocessed, or like, you know, this drum tone where you hear a song and you can tell that there's samples being used. And if you don't necessarily want that for your genre, then this episode is for you.
Absolutely. Yeah. I love this topic. There is this weird rift in the pro audio community of mixers between people that like drum samples and people that don't like drum samples. And in my experience, people that don't like drum samples generally have no idea how to use drum samples properly, which is a harsh blow. If you're one of those people and you're listening, I'm sorry, but I'm being honest. I don't think you know how to do it right.
Yeah, I totally agree. I don't think it's a question of whether or not you should use drum samples. It's just how you use it, like how it sounds. What's the result? That's the only thing that matters. So I don't think there should even be a debate about whether or not you should use drum samples. All that matters is what comes out of the speakers. And so, yeah, exactly. I agree. All right. So I'm curious to see, as always with these kind of episodes, I'm curious to see if your process is similar to mine, Malcolm, or if we do things differently. Because even though we say there's a right and a wrong approach, there's typically more than one right approach to things like that. So again, all that matters is the result. But I think there will be some common things that we both recommend or don't recommend if you want natural sounding drums with samples. And yeah, let's go through this. So the first thing is already something that is different, I think, between the two of us, because like I think you use key spikes, right, to trigger samples, and I use Midi. What that means is, real quick, we can't go through all the details in one podcast episode, but just real quick, in case you're not aware, the way you trigger drum samples is there's three ways actually. The first is you could just put a trigger plugin on a drum track, like a snare track or a kick track, and that trigger plugin detects the hits, and then it fires a sample, and you can blend within the plugin, and that's like the simplest, quickest way to do it. But there's problems with that.
There's a little hint. That's the people that are doing it wrong.
Exactly. I mean, there are people who are doing it that way who are doing it right, but there's always the exception, right? We don't recommend that. So then there's two more options. With those, you have much more control, which is what we want in this case. So the first option is you could do what Malcolm does, and you could create key spikes. These are, and you can explain that probably better, but these are small like audio blips, like it's actual audio material. So for every snare hit or every kick drum hit or every tom hit, there you have to generate a small, short burst of audio, just very quick, like a click sound or something. I don't know how exactly you do it, Malcolm, but you use that to and send it into a trigger plugin or into whatever, and the trigger plugin detects the hits with a lot more precision from these key spikes, and also you have a separate track that you can control that shows you exactly when the samples are going to be fired, and you don't have missed triggers and weird flams and stuff like that. So basically, you're creating these short blips of audio, and those trigger the samples. My approach is I do the same thing, just with MIDI notes. I generate MIDI from the original audio, and I use the MIDI notes to fire off the samples. It's the same reason, basically. I want control over what I use to trigger the samples. I want to be able to have exactly the amount of hits that I need. I want to be able to have the exact like intensity, velocity. I want to be able to make them phase aligned and all that. So we're both using sort of some sort of signal that we trigger the samples off of, and we don't do it from the original raw snare track or kick track, right?
Yes. Yeah,
so
absolutely. So you are probably already deeply confused.
Yes, I'm pretty sure you are.
And that's perfect because I've got yet another pitch for you. If you jump on that early bird pricing that we talked about at the start of the episode for Mixes Unpacked, our mixing course that you have just a matter of hours to still get in on for the early bird pricing, there is going to be a bonus module I'm making for you that is exactly about creating key spikes and MIDI spikes to do exactly this. So if you want to learn this, you get it for free included with the mixing course. And it's like its own separate little mini course that's just going to be given to you for free. So if you're confused, that's for you.
Perfect. All right. Okay, so that's the first step. You generate MIDI or key spikes just because you have more control over what you're doing with the samples, and it's the step one if you want to have like organic sounding samples that blend well with the original drum kit.
Yeah.
The next step.
Now,
Okay.
hold on. I think maybe we briefly should say why we do that, opposed to just slapping it on the track. And this will again be more thoroughly explained in the video course I was just talking about. But more or less, we are now placing these MIDI or audio blips directly at the transient of the drum, and we're checking every one. So that we know when the drum trigger, like the drum sample gets played, it is getting played perfectly phase aligned with our actual live drum as well. And that's really the key here, where if we just slap it on the track, it might hear a hi-hat that's just, been hit a split second before the snare or something and fire then, and now your sample's playing early, and it creates some phasing issues between your actual drum. You need it to be a consistent phase relationship in order for it to have a consistent sound and actually help what you're doing. So that's why we're spending all this time to create these little MIDI or audio blips.
Yes, exactly. Which leads us to step 2 here. After you create those, you've time align them, phase align them. You make sure they are sample aligned with the original hits, and you also adjust. I don't know what the process is with the key spikes, but with the MIDI, I also do a first round of like velocity adjustment. So it's not like fine adjustment because that depends on the samples that I'm using, and we're going to get to that later. But like before I choose my samples and do all that, I make sure that the velocities, meaning the intensity or the volume or whatever you want to call it, it's called velocity when we're talking MIDI, that this mirrors the performance of the drummer, basically. I might compensate for some flaws in the performance. So if the drummer is really inconsistent and I want it to be more consistent, then my MIDI will be less dynamic than the original performance. But for the most part, I want it to be close to the original performance if the drummer has been good. So so that I don't get any weird articulations or like dynamics that I don't want in the performance, right? So I just make sure that a rim shot's so it's also articulations. I make sure that a rim shot is a rim shot. I make sure that a loud hit is a loud hit, a quiet hit is a quiet hit, a ghost note is a ghost note, and that is all in time. So that's the first part of it. I don't go into too much detail here because the fine adjustment, it totally depends on the drum instrument that I'm using, like the virtual drums or the trigger or whatever, because they all react differently to different velocities and all that, and they have different articulations. So at this point, I'm just making sure that it's in the ballpark, right? So I don't know if there's a similar process to that with the key spikes or if they are all the same volume, or I don't know.
Yeah, for me, I kind of have the option as I make them to mimic the velocity of the drums, which is what I do. I usually leave it to follow the detected velocity of what's the live drum is doing. And then I can tweak from there with just using clip gain essentially. And then if it hears a loud, like big audio blip, it's going to give you a big rim shot. So you do want to be careful with that. I actually do use a lot of one shots, so it's more so just volume that I'm manipulating.
Yeah. So, all right. Then the next step is to pick the right samples, which is probably the biggest one, like the most important one, right? You have to pick samples intentionally, and you have to pick the right ones. That could mean you pick something. I do that pretty often. So there's 2 scenarios. So that could mean that you pick one that is similar to the original. So in that case, what you want to do is you want to increase the difference between the bleed and the actual drum. So you want to get less bleed. You want to have louder hits, more consistency, but you don't necessarily want to change the sound of the drum if you like what's been recorded. So in this case, I would pick something that's similar to what I've recorded, just more consistent, and it gives me more distance to the bleed and all that, so I can compress harder. I have less issues with that later. So that's the first scenario. The second one would be there's something about the raw sound that I don't really like or that I think is missing, and it's better to add that with a sample than to EQ the raw thing to make it work. So this could mean that there's a kick drum that sounds cool, but like it has not enough attack or not a hard enough attack or not enough low end. So instead of trying to EQ that, I could just pick a kick sample that's only low end or only beater attack or only even some weird click sound that's not even a kick drum. Same as with the snare drum, right? If you want a rim shot when it's not actually a rim shot, you can just find a sound that gives you the crack and the attack of the rim shot. You could do all sorts of things. Like also something you see in the mixing course, Mixes Unpacked. In my mix, I use a sample. I won't say what I use, but I use in one part, you'll see it in this course, I use a sample on a snare drum that's not even a snare drum. And it's pretty obvious that's not a snare drum, but it's cool for that part. So
Totally. Yeah. There's the sky's the limit with picking it, but you do need to choose something that makes sense. I have so many drum samples. I make them a lot of the time, and I also like purchase packs. I just love them. I love having these options. But often, what I like the most on its own, like when I'm just listening through, get a new pack, I kind of go and audition them all, just have a listen. What I think is like, oh, that is an amazing sounding snare, isn't often what I'll get to use in the mix, because I don't need a big full picture. I just need like the complete one job that's missing in the raw track sometimes, like you said, maybe it's just the attack of the drum that I need to augment, and that giant snare is just not going to work there, or maybe it's like, they recorded this in a stadium. That's not going to really fly with the rest of the drum kit sounding like it's in a room, stuff like that. Yeah. So you really got to choose what's right.
Yeah, totally. Also, picking the right samples also means being intentional with like what's actually in this sample. So that's one of the most common mistakes that I see people make. Sometimes all you want to do is augment the close mic, so you don't need a sample that has overheads and rooms and all that baked into the sample. You need a mono sample of a single snare drum hit, and you want to blend that. Sometimes though, you might want the sample because of the room or because of something else. So just be intentional. There's no right or wrong here, but I see people use some sample for whatever reason, and they don't even realize that there is room and maybe even reverb and whatever baked into the sample, and then they blend it with their close mic, and then they have other room sounds, and it becomes this mess that's not sounding natural anymore. So just do it with intention and think about what it is that is missing, what you want to augment, what you want to blend with your raw drums, and only use that. So for trigger samples, for example, if you use Slate Trigger, most of the ones that come with Trigger and most expansion packs also, if you load up a preset, you'll see 4 or 5 sometimes tracks in there, and one will be a snare top, then maybe there's a second snare top, then there's a snare bottom, then there's an overhead, and maybe there's a room or 2 rooms.
Yeah.
And you can mute all of those and just keep one, or you can use all of them, or you can create your own blend, or you can use multiple instances, one for close mics, one for overheads, one for rooms, whatever. Just be intentional about it and know that this is the case, because you might not be aware and just load one and don't think about this. So
yeah, definitely be very intentional. The next thing on our list is just, and we've touched on it, but it is checking polarity of the sample against your live drums. So we talked about the phase alignment and making sure that's just perfectly lined up, but you can't trust that all your samples are going to all be like phase positive, polarity positive, like so the transient goes up essentially on the waveform first. You just can't know that. So you have to make sure, and just, I just audition, throw it in, click the polarity button to see if it sounds better or worse, move on. Yeah. But especially if you're using multiple samples, you got to be really careful with this.
Yes, agreed. Also, depends on, the way you'd create a drum sample is you record an actual drum hit, right? Mm-hmm. So there's one factor there that you have no control of if it's somebody else's drum sample. You can cut a drum sample right at the beginning of the first actual sample of the hit, or you can leave a little gap in front of it. And some people do it out different than others. So it could be that the trigger detects when the actual snare starts, but the sample could be a little late because they left a gap in the sample that they printed. And so that is also the reason why you have to check for phase and all that. But in this first step, just check the polarity. And there's going to be another step later, at least in my case, where I, again, check that. But for now, just to audition the samples and to get a blend of first thing, just hit the polarity button and you use the one that's better, the position that's better.
I will say that sometimes the phase relationship just doesn't seem to work either way. It's just kind of like weird to spite if you flip the polarity. And what Benny's talking about probably would solve that if you just like moved it. But I usually just like that sample's out. I'm not considering it anymore.
Yeah, exactly. Totally. All right, the next one, you put that on our list, and I completely forgot about it, but I do it all the time. Like, it's totally necessary.
It's so crucial. Yeah. So it is tuning your drum samples. And guitarist minds just blew up. Tuning drums? What? Actually, I think drummers' brains just blew up. They don't seem to tune their drums either. Yes, you can tune drums. You should do it before you record. You should hire a drum tech. Everybody should hire a drum tech. They're the best. They're so valuable if you can have a great drum tech come in before you start a session and during the session. But anyways, when you choose a sample, you can, I would say maybe even all samplers, I use Slate Trigger, and that has a little knob where I can just lower or tighten the drum essentially and change the pitch of it to get it to more closely match the live drum. And now why we're doing that is that the live drum, of course, is going to have a fundamental note, but that is also bleeding into our overheads in our rooms and stuff like that. So even if you were fully replacing the close mic, you would still want to try and do this to get it to sound like it fits with the bleed into the rest of the mics on the kit. It's super helpful to do this. It'll like just fit in the mix so much better if you tune it correctly.
Yeah. Quick tip, if you don't know how to start doing that, or if you have a hard time hearing it, like use an analyzer. Just open up some analyzer, FabFilter Pro Q or something. Solo the snare, for example. I just use the snare for this because it's easy to see it with the snare drum. Solo the snare, the original one, hit play, and then watch the analyzer and like look for that around 200 bump where the fundamental is. Could be 180, could be 220, whatever. Like around 200 somewhere should be the snare fundamental, and you should see it's most often it's the loudest part of the spectrum that you see there on the analyzer. Or you'll find that what I mean, and then do the same with your sample, and that might be below or above your original snare. Then just turn that knob that Malcolm described on the trigger plugin until the two are at the same frequency, and then listen again if it's better or not. It's not always what you have to do. Sometimes it works with different pitches. I have to say that as well.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
But a lot of times, if you want it to be really invisible and blend well, that's a good starting point. And it's also a good exercise to just get a feel for what we actually mean and what that sounds like. So just do it, like listen to the pitch, but also watch it on the analyzer and then tune it up and down until the two match, and then just find a thing that you like, basically. So there's that. And also, I want to recommend one thing. There's an amazing plugin I don't usually like Waves plugins a lot or use them a lot, but there's an amazing plugin called Torque that lets you retune drums in a way. So it can be used as a simple tuning thing, just like the one in Trigger where you tune it up or down. But the cool thing about it is you can tune the fundamental and the harmonics and the ring of it like separately. So if there's some sort of dissonant ring or something annoying about the sample, so the fundamental might be right, but like something else is dissonant, doesn't work, you can grab that and only tune that part of it sort of and make it really close. So this Torque thing is amazing. It's really cool. I grabbed it once on sale for $19 or something, and it's a really, really cool plugin.
Wow, okay, that's very interesting. I've always like seen it and kind of just thought snake oil.
No, it's actually really good. It's actually really, really good.
Cool. I'll have to give it a shot.
Because you can also retune the original drums without making the bleed sound weird, which is very cool. You can,
Awesome.
Yep. All right. So tune your samples. Then, shape, attack, and sustain to match the kit if necessary. I don't do that a lot, with the exception of shortening. Oftentimes I will shorten tom sustain. Sometimes the tom samples ring out forever, and I don't want that, so I will just shorten them. And if you use Slate Trigger, you can also do that in the plugin itself. You don't even have to use a transient designer.
Yeah, for me, the case is usually shortening the sustain of the drums as well. Like the room mics might go on too long or something, so I manipulate that. And sometimes I will choose which sample is my kick attack, and then try to remove the attack more or less from the rest of them, just to like clear up that spot, so that the click happens. But not always. This is like a less important step, but just something to be aware of, that you can manipulate the attack and sustain of your drum samples to further fit the mold of your live drum kit.
Totally.
Or you can change your live drum kit to fit your samples.
Yeah. Could also be the case. Yeah, totally. All right. Yeah. Actually, a good point. Like, could be that the attack is weak anyways in the live drums and not consistent enough, but you like the ring or the sound of the shell or something, and you could trigger an attack like sample and just tame the attack on the original snare drum to not conflict with that. So yeah, that's actually
totally works.
A thing. Yeah. All right. Then the next step would be for me to fine adjust the velocity. So I'm going back, after I've chosen my samples, after I've tuned them and shaped them and all that, I go back to the Midi and sort of do some fine adjustments there because, as I said, if I use Slate Trigger, every single sample set that I load in there will react differently to the Midi that I'm sending into the plugin. And if I don't use Slate Trigger, which is, I don't use it a lot anymore, actually. So most of the time I'm using contact instruments, or I'm using something like Superior Drummer, some sort of instrument, virtual drums thing that I trigger, that I sent the Midi to trigger drum samples. And all of them react differently to different velocities. So there are some libraries where 127 is really like full on, like so loud. Like with some samples, if you use a 127 sample, no drummer would ever hit a drum like that. It's just it just explodes. And then with other libraries, it's just a loud hit, and you can use it. And same with ghost notes. So with some libraries, you can go down to 50 or something and trigger really quiet notes, and it will sound like a ghost notes. And with others, it's like either even lower, or like you don't hear anything at 50, or it still sounds loud for some reason. All these just react differently. So I go in, I listen, and I adjust my MIDI velocities again based on the samples that I chose.
Right.
Same with the articulations. So I might use an instrument that gives me rim shots and normal snare shots, for example. So then I can go, okay, on these louder hits in this breakdown, whatever, I use the rim shots, but on the other parts, I will use normal hits.
Yeah.
Or, like these things, or there's a flam articulation or something. So I have to drag MIDI notes around to hit the right articulations. And I can only do that after I know which samples I'm going to use.
Yeah. My process is very much the same. It's just I've got a separate track for each different sound. So I might audition like something and it's like, oh, that sounds giant, but it's not going to work for the song. But then I'll think, well, maybe it'll work somewhere in the song. And then I kind of make a guess. I just delete the audio from the rest of the track except for that one spot. And then it lives there for a while until I make a decision. I don't know if you're the same as Benny, but I move pretty quick with this. I'm just like, I like it. It's there. It's live for the whole thing. When I'm jumping around the mix, I'm going to be like, ooh, delete that one spot. I just kind of start with them all there and then clean it up as I go. And then sometimes add more.
Yep. Sort of. I can't do that. Like I use MIDI, but then we get to that step. I print my samples. So what I do is like I have to commit. So I go through it all. I get the velocities right for each part. I'm not deleting the MIDI track, so I can always go back and add more or trigger another layer or whatever. So I'm not deleting that. But for my main samples throughout the song, I go through the whole track and really make sure that every part has the right articulation, the right velocity, and all of that. Right. Just because then I never keep trigger plugins on or like virtual instruments on. I always print them before I start the mix. So, and then I might add some extra flavor in a part or so, and that might be off of a trigger plugin. But even that is going to be printed in the end most of the time.
Yeah. So that requires you to kind of take care of the step earlier in the process. Yeah.
I'm not saying that I'm never doing anything later in the process. I quite often do, but then I just go back to the MIDI and trigger something else, layer it where I want it to be, and then I just print it again, and then I move on. But yeah, I do this first pass of going through the whole MIDI thing, making sure everything's correct, and then I treat it like a drum kit, basically.
Cool.
So yeah, so to be able to do that, I need to do the next step, which is, and that might be different for you as well, because if you leave the trigger plugins on, for example, this is different, or you don't have to do what I do. So I need to make sure that the routing is correct. And what that means is when I have an instrument like the Room Sound drum samples that I love, it's a company called Room Sound that I really, 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 really love. And you'll find an affiliate link to those in the show notes if you want that. So it's same price for you, but I get a little commission if you buy through that link. Thank you. These are really amazing samples. No, I really like them. I bought all of them myself, and I really love them and use them all the time.
They're amazing.
Yeah. And these are ones that I use often. So with a drum library like that, it's an instrument. It's a virtual instrument inside your DAW. And the default is that it spits out a stereo mix of the drum kit. And you don't want that. You want to enable multi-output routing so that each of the elements of the kit are like they land on a separate track, on their own track in the DAW, just like normal audio tracks. So you get one track for the kick, one for the snare, one for the toms, or even more if there's multiple mics. So you need to enable that multi-output routing and then get the routing correct so that it shows up in your DAW. And then you can print the samples. And then you can just hit export or commit or render or whatever your DAW calls that. And this will then give you WAV files of each individual piece of the kit. And you have those in the session. And it's like the same as like, it looks as if you had recorded a real drum kit. That's what I do basically. So I get the routing right. I make sure that I do everything we've been talking about. And then I get separate tracks for close mics, room mics, overheads, snare top, snare bottom, all of that. And they end up as WAV files in my session, which means if I started out with 16 drum tracks that somebody sent to me, after that step, I might have 40 or so, because I get an additional set of close mics, and then I have maybe 3 pairs of additional room mics or whatnot, but that's it. And I might have to deal with like 5 snare drums, but I'm fine with that because I'm then bussing them together into groups so that it's not overwhelming. So it might sound confusing now, but that's the way I do it. I just always want to treat it as if somebody had recorded these tracks as microphones on a kit. That's what I want.
Great method. I love this because this is so timely with the course. Like, again, Betty and I did different videos. So it's not both of us mixing a song. It's us doing it separately. So you'd get to see our different workflows around drum samples and kind of visually understand what we're talking about here inside of Mixes Unpacked. That's great.
Totally. So do you print samples at all, or do you leave the trigger plugins on?
I usually leave them open because it lets me, it's like an import session data thing for me. So when I do the next song, I want to start with those same triggers being loaded up as a starting point for the next song kind of thing.
You know what the solution to that is? You have to start mixing whole records in one session.
I think about this all the time. I really do.
All the time.
I really do. I just feel like my computer would want to self-destruct.
Yeah. I don't mean in one sitting, like in one go, but I mean in one DAW session. So I might have 10 songs in one session. It's automation hell and like CPU hell, but like so many other things are so much cooler. And I often do it.
There's definitely some big perks, but that's an aside from this episode. But usually I leave it open, but it is not uncommon for me to check the phase. Like, so it's really quick for me just to highlight a section and print that. It like takes like 0 seconds with my fast computer, and then I can just look at it, zoom in, be like, oh yeah, it's all good. And I only do that if I'm slightly concerned that something just doesn't sound dead on. So I'm pretty picky about it sounding like the phase is really working if I'm going to use a sample, period.
Yeah. I mean, you can always trust your ears, and even if it's not technically perfect, if it sounds good, it is good. Yes. So no need to print it because of that. That's this perfectionist, weird over-engineering part of me in my brain that just likes to see that it's perfect, and so I like to have the waveforms. But the main reason actually is that I find that sometimes individual hits will still, I mean, you have the key spikes and you can correct there, but sometimes individual hits still don't sound quite right for whatever reason. And I just want the actual final thing. I want to be able to grab that and align it. So that's one thing. And then the other reason for me is with round robin samples, no print of the mix, no export is going to be the same. And again, that's something that my brain just doesn't like. I want one version, one performance, one recording. I don't want a different snare hit every single time I export the song, which happens if you don't use one-shots. If you use one-shots, it's not a problem. But if you don't use one-shots, then I had situations where I kept the plugin on, and then there was a snare roll, and it sounded perfectly fine to me, and I sent it to the band, and then they were like, hey, there's this weird one hit in the snare roll that sort of sticks out. Why is that we didn't play it that way? And I listened to that, and indeed, there was one hit that just was a tiny bit louder than the rest, and it was the wrong feeling for that roll. And it was just because when I've listened to it, it sounded fine, and when I printed it, a different sample got triggered, and then it sounds slightly different, and that's enough for me to just want to print the final thing, and then that's what's in the session. And the final reason probably is just for archiving purposes. I always have this fear of that like someday trigger might not load anymore, or like is not compatible anymore with my system or whatever. And if I have a set of multi-tracks for the whole session, then I can theoretically, I can always do a remix, or like somebody else can work on this thing probably 20 years from now. But if if only the plugins exist and the session with the plugins, who knows if anybody can open that up.
Yeah. The samples could easily be moved to a different folder and not be able to connect, stuff like that. Yep. I do want to augment my answer to include that if I'm using like round robin stuff as well, I usually do commit that as well. It's just one shots that I'm more feel safe about. And if there is a weird hit, because like you said, there's sometimes it just doesn't. It seems like one's just out, and I can't explain it. But I'll just grab the key spike and move it to trigger earlier or later a sample.
Yeah. And for archiving, I mean, you could also do it differently. You could just batch that step, and after you're done, you just archive the sessions and print it, and then you don't have to do it in the mix. Like there's always a way.
There's also like that is technically totally the right way to go, but it's also one of those, like, if you need your multi-track sessions 5 years from now, it's probably because you plan to do a remix and the new mixer is going to just choose new samples anyways.
yes, that also.
So I don't usually sweat the OCD stuff as much as maybe you do.
Yeah, that's a whole thing. Like, exactly. Oh man! All right, so. Like there's a saying, how you do one, like what's this thing? Like how you do one thing is how you do everything, or something like that.
I don't know. It sounds like a good saying. I'm not sure I'm familiar.
Yeah, I think it's similar to that. Like, so you can imagine I do everything like that, and now it's like life is not easy inside my brain sometimes.
It's a lot of jobs.
Yeah, exactly. All right. So, okay. So then, what I do is I treat the original and the corresponding sample together as one new drum if possible. What that means is if I have a snare close mic and a snare close mic sample, then I will group those two together, as I said, after I've printed them, and then I treat them as one new drum. So just like you would with a snare top and a snare bottom, I might have a snare top, a snare bottom, a snare sample, and another snare sample, and all four of those go to my snare bus, sort of, and they become my snare drum. I don't think of them as individual hits. I might tweak them individually if there's something I need to correct. But in general, I try to avoid that because I feel like I want to keep maximum like impact and phase
coherency.
Like I want coherency, exactly, that's the word. And the more you manipulate the individual sounds that you then sum together, the more you're going to smear the transients. You get you again introduce phase issues. So you might have very carefully made sure that the phase is perfect, but then you throw a bunch of filters on your samples and individual drums and stuff, and those filters and things you do change the phase again, but you don't see it visually, and all of a sudden the snare sounds weaker and you don't know really why. So I correct things if I have to, but if possible, I've just chosen the right samples so that they blend well, and then I treat them together as one new drum, and then preserves the transients, that preserves the punch, the impact, the size of it, and the more you do to individual things that you sum together, the more you're smearing that, and the less impact you get, I feel like. So that's why I like to do that. And also, it's just less overwhelming. I don't want to treat 4 snare drums, I want to treat 1. So I create my blend, and that's my snare drum.
Yeah. 100%.
Same for toms and kicks and all that. I always say snare drum, but I mean in general.
Yeah. I feel like I am personally thinking more about the individuals than they say you do, but I do the same thing in that they're all going to a bus, and that is like when, if the revision says snare up, I'm just grabbing that. I think that's my first step, is assess it as a single drum, and then if I need to go tweaking under it, the options there, I can open up that folder.
Yeah, totally. Then also, the same thing is true, by the way, not just for the close mics, but for example, if I use trigger, that's something I don't see a lot of people do, but it makes sense to me. If I use trigger, I never say never, but in general, I don't use one instance of trigger that will have my snare close mic, my room mic, and my overheads. What I will do is, if I want overheads and rooms and all that, because I like the original just wasn't tracked in a great room or whatever, if I want that, which I usually do, then I create 3 instances of Slate Trigger, like 3 different tracks with Slate Trigger on it. I will send my MIDI track to all 3 of them, and one will have the close mics, one will have the overheads, and one will have the room mics. And then the outputs of those, or the printed tracks from those, will go to my snare bus, then the overheads will go to my kit bus, which has all the overheads and like cymbal mics and stuff like that. And then my room samples will go to my room bus. So again, I treat them like parts of the kit, and I will create 3 instances, because otherwise I don't know where to send them, basically. Because if I have a snare track that has the rooms and the overheads and the snare close mic in one trigger instance, if I send that to my snare bus, chances are I'm going to over compress or over EQ the room. It will sound bright maybe, or harsh or weird in a way. I don't want that. I maybe just want to treat the direct sample and not the room sample. And if I want to crush my rooms, for example, I don't want the close mic in there. So I want to have them separate. And in that case, I would just create 3 instances. So I group together what belongs together and treat them as one new set of mics.
Perfect. It all makes sense to me.
Great. Awesome. All right. Then the next one I think is also big. Don't overprocess samples. This is probably, again, something that's a little different between you and I, Malcolm, because you said you use more. What I want to say is, I think you use one-shots more often than I do, and one-shots typically are pretty processed, and you just audition them, I guess. And if they are a great fit, then you choose them, and then you use them. I most of the time use unprocessed samples or barely processed samples. I mix them with the original drums, and then I treat them as a new drum. So I don't have to be careful with the processing, because all I'm using is unprocessed samples. Now, is that correct? Like, do you use processed samples a lot? Because I don't.
Totally true. Yeah.
Okay.
And just same when I'm making my own samples, I'm processing the heck out of them to kind of get them to a finished sound. And then I'm just really picky while choosing them. It's got to be like, I love it. Otherwise, like, because it's so processed, it'll be like, this is really weird sounding. That's the wrong one out. And just like keep going through. But yeah, I think that is a difference in our workflow, is that I'm very looking for the finished sound audition kind of thing. Like the job I wanted it to, like, that I'm hoping for it to be filled, should be a very obvious thing for me. And so yeah, one-shots are usually my go-to.
So then you will have to apply less processing in the mix to your overall snare, right? Because you're blending in an already pretty decent sounding snare with the original one, or entirely replacing it.
It's totally common for my like one-shots to not have anything on them. Like there might be like I said, I'll sometimes try and shorten the like sustains on my snares or something like that. And there's usually an EQ that's open, but it doesn't mean it's actually engaged or doing anything. And a clipper is usually on them as well.
Okay. That's interesting. I can totally see the value in that, because it's quick and it's like an intuitive thing where you addition a couple of things, and if it doesn't work, it's just out. So I totally get that. I don't know. I don't even know why I do it the other way around. I just like the idea of like like this. I don't know. I just want to work with something that sounds like a real kit, and then I want to make it fit the song, sort of. And it's just also, I haven't used one-shots enough to really have an opinion there. I have some, and I use them occasionally, but it's more of an effects thing for me. I just like to build my drum sound myself from scratch, sort of, when I mix, which is not better, but just the way I am used to doing it.
I've 100% seen both methods done effectively. There isn't really a right or a wrong here.
Totally.
I would say there's definitely songs where I'm like rule out the use of one-shots immediately. Where if it's a very rootsy song, it's like I'm going to avoid the one-shots as my first choice, just because I think it'll be too kind of perfect sounding.
Yeah.
So in cases like that, I'll probably start with a multi-layered sample.
Yeah. It's also totally a genre thing. So for most genres that I work on, and the sound that people come to me for, it's like the natural drum sound is what I want. So it's oftentimes not the absolute biggest, like larger than life sound that you can get, because I don't want that. I want it to sound like a kit. But like if I'm mixing like metalcore or like any sort of modern metal, which I do also a lot and I also enjoy, then I immediately go to one-shots, because that's just the sound. That's the consistency. That's the explosive sound that you want. So in this case, I don't even start with like very organic sounding samples. I immediately go for the most like blown out thing that I have, basically. And like, so it's totally a genre thing too. But for like a punk rock song or an indie song or something, I usually reach for something that just fits in there pretty invisibly, and it only gives me more options to treat the drum kit better, basically.
Totally, yeah. They're just different tools for different jobs. That's how you think of them. Yeah.
Okay. Cool. Awesome. Yeah. And the don't overprocess thing here is something that we wanted to mention, because that's also something we see people do all the time. When you get a library, like, I don't know, any preset in any of these virtual drum kits that are processed. And I don't even want to say, I don't even want to name one here because they are all good. And so, but like there are some out there that are heavily processed, and all of them have presets that are pretty processed. And of course, you want to use that when you're writing, and it's quick and fast. And you can also use it when you're mixing. But what people do a lot is they pick this sort of mix-ready preset that already sounds like a finished drum kit. Then they treat it as if it was like raw samples because they see someone mix a song and then they think they have to compress and EQ and do all these moves that these mixers make in the tutorials. And they ignore the fact that all this has already been done to their samples. So they do it twice, sort of. And it ends up being overly bright is one of the symptoms that I see a lot. So sometimes you have these very weird sounding, super clicky snare drums that are super annoying, that you have this weird like attack to them. That's one part. And then sometimes they just seem to get very thin or scooped because they push the fundamental, they push the top end, so the mids get even less, and that might have already been done in the actual sample. So that's something I see a lot. So yeah, just think about what you are using and whether or not it really needs treatment. It's totally okay to just blend something and then don't touch it anymore. Like it could be fine as is, or it could need minimal adjustment to just fit the song, but you don't have to process it just because you know these techniques that mixers use. If your sample already has that baked into it, you don't have to do it again.
Yeah, that again goes back to the importance of choosing the right sample. Like if it's going to take a bunch of processing, why are you using it? It doesn't seem like you chose the right tool for the job.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, and then the last step here for me is I do that with a kit without samples as well, but I think it's part of the realism, or part of what makes it sound like a kit again to me, is what I do on the drum bus. I like to add glue and like sort of energy and vibe to it on the drum bus, or on parallel buses that I blend with the kit. So what that does is it gives this pump to the drums. And again, to our mixing course, I saw you do that on your, you mangled those drums on your mix. And I loved it. Like the pump they have, it's audibly pumping, but not in a way that's annoying. Like it's just right for the song, and I like that a lot. And it just sounds like a drummer who's playing with more excitement, more energy, who's hitting harder. You know, it just moves, and that's what I want, depending on the genre, of course. But that also gives me back the impression of just being in a room with a loud drummer. Because what happens if you do that? If you've ever been in a jam space or a small club or something where somebody was playing the drums loudly, your ears will compress. Like it's loud. It's a lot of energy. There's pumping. It's not sounding beautiful, right? And you don't want that super clean, super polished separation that you often get when people use samples a lot. You oftentimes want the cohesiveness and the energy and the slight pumping and the sense of being in a room with a loud drum kit. And I can create that on the drum bus and with like parallel buses. And that glues all the individual pieces together for me really well. And so that's how I think about that. It's partly controlling the dynamics, but mostly to me, it's pump and energy and excitement.
Yeah, totally. I think for me, drum samples actually get a lot easier to mix in and make natural when you do have that like pump going, because it seems to kind of round off transients and then make things less pokey. So you just kind of have more space to play with, it almost feels like. But yeah, it's just so much fun. I don't really have much more to say about that, but I for one love using drum samples. It's like a very creative process for me.
Yes, totally. Yeah, absolutely. And I think what the goal is, what you want to avoid at the end, in the end here, is you want to avoid the drums in space thing that we've talked about before, where it's like you listen to a drum kit or a song, and then you have like there is a snare drum, and then there is a tom, and over there is another tom. You know, you want to hear a kit if you want it to be invisible or realistic. If not, then totally fine. There are other aesthetics where you don't want that, but in this case, so you want to avoid that. And so I think the drum bus is one thing, choosing the right samples is the other thing. And then one thing we forgot, I think, it's very quick to explain, it's just panning. I think you also have to match the panning of the original drums with the samples. Or you can, of course, you don't have to match it. Maybe there is a reason for making it wider or narrower than the original, but do it with intention. Do it intentionally.
Yeah. Yes.
And avoid like weird things like, if the rack tom is on the left, then your rack tom sample probably shouldn't be on the right. So if you use a stereo sample or something, then just flip it, you know, if it's the wrong side or whatever. Yeah. So
100%. That is very wise. You can like accidentally cause some serious damage to your kit if you're not careful with that stuff.
Exactly. All right. Any other things to say? You already mentioned the thing where you said you use different things throughout the song, basically, and you print different one-shots for different parts, or you might add extra things. I do that as well. Like, that's something that during mixing, I might be like, you know what, this part just doesn't work. There's something lacking. I need something else. And then I will just, for these 4 snare hits, I will trigger something else, or whatever. So totally. You do that as well, probably? Or
and often it's a lot of subtracting. It's like, I just want the verse to have a little bit like a tighter snare drum. So let's get rid of the room mic on the verse. And then it comes back on the chorus and kind of just seems to like get bigger there, stuff like that. And yeah, sometimes it's like, I might use spikes to also just bring in other things. This isn't really making things invisible, but you can use like the snare spike to bring in claps. So you've got claps happening on each snare hit, stuff like that. You could use it to trigger a bass drop if you want. Just quickly delete the rest and this one hits there that plays a bass drop sample. You can really do a lot of cool stuff with it. And we're not going to get into the side chaining possibilities of this stuff either yet. But so it's a lot of fun. I think that this episode was actually really valuable. I think there's like a lot of little secret weapons in here that are crucial to making drum samples work.
Absolutely. Agreed. The final thing I want to mention is something that I think is really important that you added there, Malcolm, and we've just quickly talked about, well, not even touched it really, is that it's sometimes important or necessary to entirely delete small fractions of your sample track or like automate it down real low. If it just doesn't, like if you want to make it invisible, because it doesn't work sometimes, just no matter what you do. So this could be a fast drum roll. It could be like a crescendo thing that starts really quiet and then gets louder. And so you might want to automate down the sample or delete it entirely for that. Sometimes it looks really weird. Sometimes I entirely replace the original sample, the snare, for example, but I will leave the ghost notes in. So I will use the original just for the ghost notes because the triggered ghost notes might not sound right, or I will, I just use for quick snare rolls and stuff like that. It might be necessary to just automate it down or delete it entirely. And if you want to do that, it helps to pick the right sort of samples, because if you've chosen a sample that's not too different from what the original sounded like, then that's easy to do. If you picked something that's completely different, then it's going to be obvious when you switch back and forth, right? So
Totally. Yeah. As with all things audio, it's not right until it's right. So just do it, delete, add, whatever you need to do to get it right.
Yeah. And pro tip, we mentioned it in another episode. If you want to make it absolutely invisible and get away with the least amount of like samples, or make sure it sounds the most like your raw kit because you like the way it sounds so much, always record samples of your kit, because you can trigger those. Like you can, when you set up, before you track the first song, when the kit is perfectly tuned and all is like the way it's supposed to be, just track samples, and lots of them. Just track hundreds of samples of the whole kit. Like have your drummer sit there for an hour and hit things and just record it in all different velocities and stuff. And just record that to the hard drive, keep it somewhere, and then if you need it, you have it. And it's a very, very cool thing to have. So it could be one-shots that you create from that. You could even create your own multi-layer samples. You could replace the odd snare hit in an otherwise perfect take, all these things. So having these samples is a really good idea, I think. And it's also a tuning reference for the whole session. You can always go back and check if your drums are still sounding the way they're supposed to sound.
Totally, I usually just grab like a few different velocity hits, but make sure I have a really good solid hit of each drum. I'll get little hi-hat as well, stuff like that.
Yeah.
But and then it essentially gives your mixer the power to use the same drum kit. So just like, I need the snare, but I don't want any bleed. Now you have it. It's pretty cool.
Yeah. I exaggerated.
That said,
like, you
don't
don't
use
have
it
to
that
hit
much.
Yeah. And you probably shouldn't make your drummer hit it for an hour, because then you need to change drum heads. Probably,
then you need new skins.
Exactly. Just grab a couple of those. All right.
Totally.
Perfect. I think that's it. Anything you want to add?
No, that's a monster episode on drum samples.
I think so.
And again, you've got now like an hour less time to grab the mixing course. Mixes Unpacked. So jump on it. You'll learn all about this with the bonus module, which I think is worth the price of admission alone. So there you go.
I would agree. The selfrecordingband.com/mixes unpacked. All right. Talk to you next week.
See you next week.
Thank you for listening. Bye.